Get softer, smoother, and more even-toned skin after just one use with the new Gentle Exfoliating line from Cetaphil. Formulated with a unique triple acid blend that promotes surface skin cell renewal, these gentle chemical exfoliators remove dead skin cells and refine skin's texture while hydrating, resulting in softer, smoother, more even-looking skin. Shop the new Cetaphil Gentle Exfoliating line in the face and body aisles at your local Target store or online at Cetaphil.com.
Is it time to change your approach and switch to Air Supra, albuterol budesonide? Now you can virtually connect with a doctor to discuss your options and see if it's time to make a change. If appropriate, you may even be able to get a prescription for Air Supra the same day. Talk to a doctor today and see if Air Supra is right for you. Visit AirSupraConnect.com to connect with a provider.
Now, back to the Larry Kudlow Show.
So we're going to talk some more about the Fed and also which direction, where's the economy headed, with my old and dear friend Conrad DeQuadros, Senior Economic Advisor for Brean Capital and a founding partner of RDQ Economics, with my former deputy, John Riding. Thank you, Conrad, for this. I'm just reading your report after the Fed decision this past week. The Fed abandons data dependency with a 50 basis point rate cut and dovish SEP rate path. That's their dot forecast. So I was talking to John Carney, but more sort of in a more macro political sense. But your point, and I agree with this, it's hard to understand why you would have an emergency rate cut. They only do 50 basis points. I mean, they did it for COVID and 9/11. When the economy doesn't look that bad. And I was just looking this morning, Conrad, the Atlanta Fed's GDP tracker, for whatever that's worth, but they're pretty good. They got 2.9% for the third quarter, which is not an emergency by any stretch. And anyway, tell me why you think they've left data dependency.
Well, thanks for having me on, Larry. I think the points that you made are an important one in terms of the 50 basis point rate cut being tending to be something that is delivered in an emergency versus the more traditional 25 basis points. And if we look at the history of the Fed beginning to cut rates and beginning a rate cutting cycle, there's really only been two episodes in which they've started with 50 basis point rate cuts. The first was back in January of 2001, when there were signs that the economy was weakening quite significantly. Inflation was very modest back then. 1.7% was the core PCE inflation rating that they now focus on, although they weren't focused on it back then. But inflation was modest. The economy was weakening sharply. We'd had a year in which equity prices were falling sharply in 2000. And they started a rate cutting cycle with 50 basis points. The other time was in August of 2007, when we were on the precipice of a financial crisis. And it was right after employment had declined. We got the most recent employment report. It showed a decline in non-farm payrolls, and then they delivered a 50 basis point rate cut. So the point that I'm making about the lack of data dependency here is some of the points that you just made. The Atlanta Fed report, for example, which is showing GDP's tracking almost 3%. The prior quarter was 3%. The economy is doing okay. Obviously, employment growth has slowed, but it doesn't feel like an emergency. And the other point that I think is important is what's going on with inflation. They've not completed the job on getting inflation down to target. We have inflation that's still running about 0.5% above what they have defined as a target, which is 2%. I don't think that that's price stability, but they're telling us that 2% price gains is price stability. We haven't even gotten to that yet, and they're cutting rates aggressively. And that, to me, just doesn't speak of data dependency.
You are writing, you and John are writing, we have a 3-year average PCE inflation rate, more than double the inflation target. The 3 years is 4.1%. That's a really interesting point. It's interesting because it's a trend, all right? And, what's his name? Chris Waller is saying the last 3 or 4 months, the PCE has come down, I think, below target. But, that inflation's tricky business. And once it gets into the innards of the economy, there's some evidence on consumer confidence surveys that inflation expectations actually might be ticking up a little bit. But the trend is not your friend. And that's another thing the Fed is ignoring. I mean, 3 or 4 months, so what? And that's, year to year is still above the target of 2%. I believe year to year is 2.5%. And you're saying the 3 year is 4.1. That's a very interesting point and an interesting way of looking at it, Conrad.
And even looking at longer averages, the 5-year average of PCE inflation is a little above 3.5%. That's 5 years. The Fed has been missing its inflation target for 3.5 years. They don't expect to get it back down to target for another 2 years. And I'm saying that I don't even think that their target is price stability, but that's what they've told us. 2% is price stability. This idea of averaging inflation over longer periods, again, is the objective that they have set out, and they're failing to meet it. And so my question is, in this environment where the inflation problem has not yet been resolved, 5-year inflation of 3.5%, you pointed out, we wrote 3-year inflation is above 4%. And you just mentioned inflation expectations. I mean, one of the issues that I had with this move it was very poorly laid out in terms of the communications and the lead up to the decision. The Fed said that 25 basis points, they had sort of signaled that 25 basis points is the way we'll go unless the data change. And we got a pretty poor CPI inflation report. We had inflation expectations, which you just mentioned. The University of Michigan survey of inflation expectations over a 5 to 10 year period went up to 3.1%. That's the highest reading that we've had almost in a year. And in the face of that, they delivered a large rate cut. And to me, I just don't see the reasoning for it if you're trying to explain it based on the data. And again, they're telling us they're making these decisions based on the data. And I just can't draw the dots between their supposed data-based policy decisions, the 50 basis point rate cut, and the actual data that we're seeing.
Well, look, Jay Powell, and if you read the press release, it just says the economy is strong. I mean, it just says that. So that's why my first reaction, okay, whatever I think, I don't think the economy is all that strong. I mean, I think you got problems in housing and manufacturing, but the consumer is driving the economy. And if the economy is strong, you don't cut rates, or you don't cut rates by half a point. Half a point. It sounds like we're in an emergency, Conrad. We're not.
Yes, and I think some of the issues that you have, I mean, obviously there's the issue of communications in terms of the Fed didn't sort of outline they outlined their decision-making process and said that maybe if the data suggests we do something more aggressively, we'll do that. The data didn't show that.
Yeah.
And so in my opinion, what they've done here is they've sort of wasted a bullet in terms of an additional quarter-point hike, a cut that they didn't need to deliver.
All right. Conrad DeQuadros, everybody. RDQ Economics, Senior Economic Advisor, Brean Capital, an old friend. There's no better Wall Street economist than Conrad DeQuadros. A quick break, and we're going to talk about the Middle East and Israel with Aaron Cohn.